2.3 million. 2.3 million people are the number of people that the United States currently has incarcerated and living behind bars. And what makes this figure so staggering is that the United States only makes up a total of 5% of the world's population, but we house 25% of the world's prisoners. And this is not a statistic thing. It's not a matter of proportion based on geography. This is ounce for ounce, pound for pound. America locks up more of its citizens than any other nation in the world. According to a Department of Justice research that was done in 2003 entitled Effective Alternatives to Incarceration, over the last 20 years, we have seen an increase of 127% in corrections costs. And most of that goes directly to actually building prisons and housing our prisoners. So we've gone in 1983 from $11 billion to a staggering $52 billion annually. And with that, we have over 6,000 correctional facilities. We've got 1,700 state prisons, over 3,000 local jails, and almost 1,000 juvenile corrections facilities. We are single-handedly the world's largest prison industrial complex, and we also have the highest rate of recidivism in the entire world. I think it's time for us to consider alternatives to incarceration. Now, some people may argue that there's absolutely no problem with the way things are. Criminals belong behind bars. They do the crime, they do the time. But there are three main misconceptions that I want to address today. Number one, some may say that arrest rates have remained stagnant over the last couple of decades, along with sentence lengths. Now, first, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics research entitled Prevalence of Imprisonment in the United States Population, we've seen that in 1974, the U.S. only had 1.9% of its population behind bars. By 1991, that number had moved up to 5.2%. And by 2001, that number had climbed again to 6.6% of our population being held behind bars. The number two side of that is the sentence length remaining stagnant. Now that is true. Sentence lengths have remained stagnant since the 1970s because of the war on drugs and strict implementation of mandatory sentencing, limiting what judges and courts can do in their decision-making process. Number two, some may say that if we don't punish our prisoners, they're going to continue their behavior. But what we actually see is that deterrence is a much greater, much more effective way of handling people than putting them inside prisons. According to the National Institute of Justice website, their recidivism page published in June 17, 2014, the Department of Justice tracked over 400,000 prisoners. And they found that after 3 years, 40% of those prisoners were back behind bars. And by year 5, almost 77% of these folks have returned back to prison. Something is broken in our jails. These prisons are not correcting their behavior. So, again, to counter that myth, putting folks behind bars does not correct criminal behavior. And finally, number 3, criminals belong behind bars for our safety. But if we consider the fact that over 500,000 people are currently behind bars for nonviolent drug offenses, they tend to come from poorer neighborhoods. And what we're doing by incarcerating them is we're removing able-bodied men and women from the workforce. We're removing them from their communities, from their families, and we are actually destabilizing these communities, creating more crime in the long run. And we take these nonviolent prisoners and we put them in jail with violent criminals. For years and decades at a time, this only exacerbates the issue. If we could even shift that 500,000, or roughly 10% of our prison population, into a more intensive parole system or alternative programs, we would be saving over $4 billion a year. And what could we do with that money? We could improve our schools. We could improve so many things within our infrastructure, within our communities and cities. So ultimately, criminals do owe their communities. They owe society a debt for the crimes that they've committed. The question is, how do we ask them to pay for it? Do we ask them to pay for it by putting them in cages, by treating them like animals for years and decades at a time, only to make the situation worse, creating an even greater revolving door? Or do we seek alternatives? Do we address the real cause of the crime? Drug addiction, mental health. Do we find systems like parole or work release programs, or mental health counseling and drug counseling, or vocational training Do we ask them to pay for this debt in a way that later makes them a more productive member of society? Create role models. We stop this cycle of recidivism and we stabilize these lower income communities. It's time to seek real solutions. It's time to consider alternatives to incarceration that work. We owe it to our inmates and we owe it to our communities.
Yay! That was good. Very informative. Ooh.